Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Crying Baby. Jake and Emily had been looking forward to their camping trip for months. Life in the city had worn them down, and they craved the serenity of the outdoors. They chose a secluded spot in the heart of Pinecrest Forest, far from the nearest campground, to escape the noise and crowds. The first day was perfect. Warm sunlight filtered through the canopy as they pitched their tent, roasted marshmallows over the fire, and shared stories. The thick forest around them felt alive with the chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. By nightfall, the forest had quieted, leaving only the distant sound of a stream to lull them to sleep. Jake was the first awake. He sat up in his sleeping bag, confused. Something had stirred him from his slumber, but he wasn't sure what. He glanced at his watch. 2:47 a.m. Beside him, Emily was fast asleep. Then he heard it, soft and faint at first, like a far-off wail. A baby crying. Jake froze. He strained to listen, thinking it might be the wind. But no, the sound grew clearer, more distinct. He shook Emily awake. "What is it?" she mumbled, groggy. "Listen," Jake whispered. Emily rubbed her eyes and sat up. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable. A baby crying, somewhere in the woods. "Is there a family camping nearby?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with concern. Jake shook his head. "We're miles from the nearest campsite." They unzipped the tent flap and shone their flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the trees, but it revealed nothing unusual. The crying persisted, coming from deeper in the woods, just beyond the reach of the light. "Maybe someone's lost," Emily suggested. Jake hesitated. "It doesn't make sense. Why would there be a baby out here in the middle of the night?" The crying grew louder, closer. A shiver ran down Jake's spine. "We should check it out," Emily said, grabbing her jacket. Jake grabbed her arm. "No, something feels off. Let's stay put." Emily wanted to argue, but couldn't shake the unease creeping over her. Reluctantly, she agreed, and they retreated into the tent, zipping it up tightly. The cries continued for another hour, sometimes loud and heart-wrenching, other times faint and distant. Eventually, they faded away altogether, leaving the forest eerily silent. The couple barely slept, their nerves on edge. When dawn finally broke, they ventured outside to examine the area. The first thing they noticed was the absence of wildlife. The usual morning chorus of birds was missing. The forest was unnaturally quiet. Then they saw them, small footprints, no bigger than a child's, pressed into the soft dirt around their campsite. The prints were strange, though, barefoot and unusually deep, as if whatever made them had been unnaturally heavy. They followed the tracks for a short distance before they abruptly disappeared near the tree line. No drag marks, no sign of where they could have gone, just an unsettling end to the trail. Jake and Emily packed up their gear in record time. As they loaded their car, Emily glanced back at the forest. "Do you think it was really a baby?" she asked. Jake didn't answer. His mind was racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. They drove away, leaving the dense woods behind, but the memory of the cries and the footprints haunted them for years. To this day, they don't know what they heard that night. Locals later told them about the legend of the weeping child, a ghostly figure said to lure people into the woods. Those who followed the cries were never seen again. Jake and Emily considered themselves lucky. They didn't investigate. Story 2. The Figures in the Fog. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. A group of 5 friends, Liam, Sophie, Jake, Emma, and Ava, decided to camp near a remote lake deep in the wilderness. The lake was miles away from civilization, surrounded by dense trees and known for its serene beauty. They arrived on Friday evening, set up their tents, and spent the night sharing stories by the campfire under a canopy of stars. The first night passed uneventfully, the soft sounds of the forest lulling them to sleep. But when they woke up the next morning, the air was different, heavy and damp. A thick fog had rolled in overnight, cloaking the lake and the surrounding trees in an impenetrable gray. "It's like we're in a horror movie," Jake joked as he lit the camp stove to make coffee. "Don't jinx it," Emma said, shivering. Despite the warmth of the season, the fog seemed to carry a chill that seeped into their bones. As they prepared breakfast, Ava noticed something strange. "Do you see that?" she asked, pointing toward the edge of the fog near the trees. The others turned to look. There, in the swirling mist, were faint, shadowy shapes. They looked like people, but it was hard to tell. The figures stood still, barely visible, their outlines blurred by the fog. "It's just the light playing tricks," Liam said, though his voice wavered. "The fog messes with your depth perception." They tried to ignore the figures and continued with their morning routine, but the shadows didn't disappear. If anything, they seemed to move, slowly, subtly, edging closer to the campsite. Every time someone glanced toward the trees, the figures appeared a little nearer than before. "I don't like this," Sophie said, clutching her jacket tightly. "What if it's other campers messing with us? Then why don't they say something?" Jake asked, his usually confident tone tinged with unease. "This isn't funny." The group decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights and a growing sense of dread, they approached the edge of the fog. But as they got closer, the figures seemed to retreat, dissolving deeper into the mist. It was as if the shadows were alive, deliberately avoiding them. "Hello," Liam called out. His voice echoed, but there was no response, only the eerie silence of the forest. They returned to the campsite, uneasy but determined to stick it out. By midday, the fog showed no signs of lifting, and the shadows continued to hover at the edges of their vision. Every now and then, one of them would spot movement, a flicker of motion in the mist, but when they looked directly, there was nothing there. As night fell, the tension grew unbearable. The group lit a large fire, hoping the light would drive off whatever was lurking in the fog. But the figures didn't retreat. Instead, they grew bolder. This time, the friends could see more detail, the outlines of long, thin limbs, heads that were slightly too large, and movements that were unnervingly smooth, almost gliding. "They're not people," Ava whispered, her voice shaking. "Whatever they are, They're not human. The friends huddled close, their backs to the fire, eyes darting toward the figures that now circled the campsite. The shadows were no longer trying to hide. They moved deliberately, closing the distance, their forms flickering in and out of the fog like a nightmare brought to life. "We have to leave," Sophie said, grabbing her backpack. "We can't stay here, but it's pitch black out there," Jake argued. "We'll get lost. Better than staying here," Emma snapped. Without another word, they began packing in frantic silence, their hands shaking as they stuffed gear into their bags. The figures were closer now, their shapes looming just beyond the firelight. One of them leaned forward, and for a brief moment they saw its face, or what should have been its face. Instead, there was only smooth, pale skin where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. That was the breaking point. The friends abandoned what they couldn't carry and bolted into the woods, guided only by the weak beams of their flashlights. The fog made every direction look the same, and they stumbled over roots and rocks as the shadows followed, their movements eerily quiet despite the pursuit. After what felt like hours, the fog began to thin, and they saw the faint glow of dawn breaking through the trees. The shadows didn't follow beyond the mist. Exhausted and shaken, they finally reached the trailhead where their car was parked. Without a word, they climbed in and drove away, vowing never to speak of what they had seen. To this day, none of them can explain what happened at that lake. But they all agree on one thing. Those figures in the fog were watching them, waiting, and if they had stayed a moment longer, they might never have left the woods at all. Story 3. The Uninvited Dinner Guest. The Miller family was looking forward to their weekend camping trip in the heart of Yellowstone National Park. The towering pines, the crisp mountain air, and the escape from the noise of city life were exactly what they needed. The first day had been perfect, hiking scenic trails, spotting wildlife, and sharing stories around a crackling campfire. As dusk settled over their campsite, the family prepared a hearty dinner: grilled chicken, baked beans, and roasted marshmallows for dessert. Laughter echoed through the clearing as they enjoyed the meal together. Night soon fell, and the family began cleaning up. Mr. Miller reminded everyone to store food properly to avoid attracting bears. But exhaustion from the day's activities got the better of them. Mrs. Miller left a plate of scraps on the picnic table, promising herself she'd take care of it in the morning. They retreated to their tent, zipped themselves in tightly, and drifted off to sleep. Hours later, a strange noise pierced the stillness of the night. It was a wet, slurping sound, followed by the distinct crunch of teeth breaking through bone. Mrs. Miller stirred, nudging her husband awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "Probably just a raccoon or something," Mr. Miller mumbled, barely opening his eyes. But the sound grew louder. Whatever it was, it wasn't small. Mr. Miller sighed, grabbed his flashlight, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of light illuminated the picnic table. What they saw made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. A pale, emaciated man crouched on the table like a wild animal. His clothes were tattered and stained, and his bony hands clawed through the leftover food. He shoved handfuls of chicken and beans into his mouth, chewing noisily, oblivious to the flashlight's beam. "Hey, who are you?" Mr. Miller shouted, his voice trembling. The man froze, his sunken eyes locking onto the light. For a moment, he seemed more beast than human. Then, with a guttural growl, he leaped off the table and sprinted toward the tree lean, disappearing into the shadows. The family sat in stunned silence, their hearts racing. "We have to call for help," Mrs. Miller whispered, clutching their youngest child close. Mr. Miller nodded, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his phone. But deep in the forest, cell service was non-existent. They spent the rest of the night wide awake, huddled together, waiting for the first light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, they ventured cautiously out of the tent. The picnic table was a mess, scraps of food scattered, claw marks gouged into the wood. The ground around the campsite was littered with footprints. They reported the incident to a park ranger, who listened with a furrowed brow. "This isn't the first time we've heard about something like this," the ranger admitted. "There have been sightings of a man living in the woods. Some think he's a hermit, others say he's not all there, but it's rare for him to come this close to people." The ranger advised them to pack up and move to a campsite closer to the ranger station, just to be safe. The Millers didn't hesitate. As they drove away, Mrs. Miller glanced back at the clearing, her unease lingering. Somewhere in those woods, the pale man still roamed, scavenging for his next meal. And the Millers would never forget the night they came face to face with the uninvited dinner guest. Story 4. The Floating Lantern. Ryan and Chris had been planning their wilderness adventure for months. They were experienced hikers, always eager to explore trails less traveled. This time, their destination was a remote section of forest in the Pacific Northwest, far from cell service, crowds, and civilization. After a long day of trekking, they found the perfect spot to set up camp. Just off the trail, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. The evening was calm, the only sounds coming from the chirping crickets and the occasional rustle of nocturnal animals. They built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and chatted under a sky full of stars before retiring to their tent. Around midnight, Ryan woke up, needing to relieve himself. As he unzipped the tent, the cool night air rushed in, and he stepped outside. That's when he saw it, a faint glow in the distance, bobbing gently between the trees. "Chris, wake up," Ryan whispered, shaking his friend awake. "There's someone out there." Chris groaned, but crawled out of his sleeping bag. Together, they watched the light grow brighter as it moved closer. At first, they thought it was another hiker, maybe someone lost or looking for help. The light had the unmistakable warmth of an old-fashioned lantern, flickering and swaying as though carried by a hand. "Hello," Ryan called out, his voice breaking the silence. There was no response, just the sound of the wind brushing through the trees. The lantern kept moving closer, and it was then they realized something was wrong. The light wasn't held by anyone or anything. It hovered in midair, a perfect orb of golden flame, as if suspended by an invisible thread. "What the hell?" Chris muttered, backing toward the tent. The lantern came to a stop about 10 feet from their campsite, hanging in the air like a firefly frozen in time. Ryan and Chris stood frozen, hearts pounding. The glow cast eerie, flickering shadows across their faces, illuminating their fear. Should we do something? Ryan whispered. Like what? Chris shot back, his voice trembling. Touch it. As if reacting to their words, the lantern began to spin slowly, its light dimming and flaring in an unnatural rhythm. The air around them grew colder, and a low hum began to vibrate through the forest like a swarm of unseen insects. Okay, I'm done with this, Chris said, grabbing Ryan's arm. Let's get out of here. Before they could move, the lantern darted away, weaving through the trees with impossible speed. It stopped again at the edge of their campfire's light, lingering for a moment as if watching them. Then, without warning, it extinguished itself, plunging the forest into darkness. The two men stood in silence, their breaths visible in the cold night air. They listened intently, but there was no sound, no footsteps, no voices, no rustling of the underbrush. It was as if the forest itself had been holding its breath. Well, what was that? Ryan finally managed to say. Chris shook his head. I don't know, but I'm not sticking around to find out. They quickly packed their gear, abandoning any thought of sleep. The hike back to the trailhead was a blur, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sending shivers down their spines. The forest, once a place of adventure and beauty, now felt oppressive and menacing. When they finally reached their car at dawn, they sat in stunned silence, staring at the trees. Neither of them spoke much on the drive home, but the image of the floating lantern lingered in their minds. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of Ryan, and he began researching legends from the area. He found stories of ghostly lanterns, often seen by travelers who ventured too deep into the forest. Some claimed the lights were the spirits of lost hikers, doomed to wander the woods forever. Others believed they were warnings, guiding hikers away from unseen dangers or toward them. Chris refused to talk about the experience, insisting it was better left in the past. But Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that the lantern hadn't just been a random encounter. It had felt deliberate, as though it had been watching them, testing them. To this day, neither Ryan nor Chris has returned to the forest. And on quiet nights, when Ryan closes his eyes, he swears he can still see the lantern's glow, floating just beyond the edge of the dark. Story 5. The Disappearing Hiker. Paul loved the solitude of the wilderness. For years, he'd sought refuge in the Rocky Mountains, pitching his tent far from the noise of civilization. This trip was no different. A week-long escape into the untouched beauty of nature, surrounded by towering pines and the distant echo of rushing streams. By his third day, Paul had settled into the rhythm of the wild. He spent his afternoons fishing and hiking, evenings cooking over a fire, and nights gazing at the stars. It was during one such tranquil evening that he first saw the stranger. The man emerged from the trees as the sun dipped below the horizon. His clothes were worn and dirty, his face pale and gaunt. He clutched a battered backpack and looked relieved to see Paul's fire. Thank God, the man said, his voice trembling. I've been lost for days. Paul, startled but sympathetic, waved him closer. You okay, buddy? You look like you've had a rough time. The man nodded, his sunken eyes scanning the camp. Got turned around off the trail. No food, no water for the last 2 days. Paul gestured toward the fire. Sit down. I've got some stew cooking. You can stay here tonight." The man sank to the ground with a weary smile. "You're a lifesaver." They talked as the fire crackled. The man introduced himself as Andrew and claimed he had been hiking solo but lost his bearings during a storm. He spoke in disjointed sentences, as though struggling to recall details. Paul chalked it up to exhaustion and didn't press. Andrew barely touched the stew, but seemed to regain some energy as they talked. He shared vague stories about his love for hiking, mentioning places Paul recognized but with an odd detachment, like he was recalling someone else's memories. Paul noticed something unsettling. Andrew's demeanor shifted with the flickering flames. Sometimes he seemed present, grateful for the company, but other times his gaze grew distant, his eyes hollow. "You should get some rest," Paul finally said, uneasy but unsure why. Andrew nodded and crawled into the spare sleeping bag Paul had offered. "Thanks," he murmured. When Paul awoke the next morning, the campsite was eerily still. The fire had burned out, leaving behind a faint trail of smoke. Andrew's sleeping bag lay empty, his belongings scattered as if he had stepped away and forgotten to return. Paul called out into the woods, "Andrew, you out there?" Silence. He waited for hours, searching the surrounding area, but there was no sign of Andrew. His battered backpack, boots, and even a pocket knife remained at the campsite, untouched. Confused and a little unnerved, Paul decided to pack up and head back to town. At the ranger station, Paul reported the incident, describing Andrew in detail. The rangers exchanged uneasy glances before one of them spoke. "Did you say his name was Andrew?" Paul nodded. "Yeah, that's what he told me." "Why?" The ranger sighed and pulled out a faded missing persons poster from a drawer. Paul's stomach turned cold as he saw the face on the flyer. It was Andrew. "This man went missing 5 years ago," the ranger said. "He disappeared during a solo hike, just a few miles from where you were camping. Search parties never found him. We assumed he got caught in a storm or had an accident." Paul stared at the flyer, his mind racing. "But he was there. He talked to me. He slept at my campsite." The ranger shook his head. "You're not the first to say that. Over the years, we've had a few reports like yours. People seeing him, talking to him, even offering him food. But he always disappears by morning." Paul left the ranger station in a daze, haunted by the encounter. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Andrew's hollow gaze, heard his faint voice thanking him for his kindness. Years later, Paul still couldn't shake the memory. He never returned to the Rockies, and every time he told the story, he couldn't help but wonder. Had he met a lost soul still wandering the mountains, or something far more inexplicable? Either way, he knew one thing for certain. There are places in the wilderness where the past lingers, and not all who are lost are truly gone. Story 6. The Howl That Wasn't. The Alaskan wilderness is as vast as it is unforgiving. For a group of friends, Mike, Sarah, Jake, and Emily, a week-long camping trip in this remote region was meant to be an escape from the hustle of city life. They had driven hours to reach a secluded spot far from any marked trails, setting up camp in a clearing surrounded by dense forest and snow-capped peaks. The first 2 days were uneventful, filled with fishing, hiking, and stargazing. By the third night, The group felt at ease with their surroundings, enjoying the quiet solitude that only a place this remote could offer. They gathered around a roaring campfire, laughing and sharing stories, when the first howl pierced the night. It came from deep within the forest, long and low, rising to a mournful pitch. The group froze. "Wolves," Mike said, though his voice was uncertain. Jake frowned. That didn't sound like any wolf I've heard before. The group stayed close to the fire, their laughter replaced by tense silence. The howl came again, this time closer. It was louder, deeper, and far too long for any known animal. Emily, clutching her blanket tightly, whispered, "It doesn't sound right." "It's wrong." Mike tried to rationalize it. "Maybe it's just the echo. Sound carries weird in the mountains." But even he didn't believe his own words. The howls continued sporadically through the night, each one closer than the last. They seemed to surround the campsite, moving from one side of the forest to the other with unnatural speed. At times, it felt as though the howls were coming from multiple sources, yet they blended into a single, otherworldly sound. "Maybe we should leave," Sarah suggested, her voice trembling. "Leave and go where?" Jake countered, "It's pitch black, and we're miles from the car. If it is wolves, wandering around in the dark would be worse." Reluctantly, they decided to stay put, stoking the fire higher and keeping a wary eye on the shadows beyond its glow. They slept in shifts, each one hearing the howls continue, relentless and haunting, until the first light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, the howls ceased. The forest was eerily silent, the air heavy with an oppressive stillness. Exhausted but determined to understand what had terrorized them, the group decided to search the surrounding area. They expected to find tracks, something to explain the source of the sounds, but the forest floor revealed nothing. The soft earth near their campsite was undisturbed. No paw prints, no broken branches, no sign of any animal. "This doesn't make sense," Jake muttered, staring at the pristine ground. "What if it wasn't an animal?" Emily asked hesitantly. Mike dismissed the idea. "Then what? A prank? There's no one out here but us." As they packed up their gear, the group couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed darker than it should have been, the towering trees oppressive in their silence. On the drive back, they spoke little of the experience, each lost in their own thoughts. They had come to Alaska seeking adventure and tranquility, but what they found was something they couldn't explain, something that gnawed at their sense of reality. Weeks later, Emily decided to research the area. She discovered that local legends spoke of the Kushtaka, a shape-shifting creature said to emit eerie cries to lure people deeper into the wilderness. Whether it was folklore or something else, none of the group ever returned to the Alaskan wilderness. The howls stayed with them, a chilling reminder that some things in the wild defy explanation. Story 7. The Stranger in the Forest. John had always been drawn to the solitude of the forest. There was something deeply calming about being alone in the vastness of nature, away from the noise and distractions of everyday life. It was his way of recharging, finding clarity, and reconnecting with the world around him. This particular camping trip was no different. He'd driven up to a remote part of the Pacific Northwest, far from any marked trails or busy campsites. The air was thick with the smell of pine, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant call of a bird. It was perfect. John had set up camp beside a quiet stream, a peaceful spot he'd found during his previous trips to the area. The tent was pitched, the campfire crackled softly, and the world felt right. As the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the forest floor, John settled into his camp chair with a warm cup of coffee, watching the night slowly consume the day. That's when he first saw him. In the distance, between the trees, a figure stood still. At first, John thought it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps a stump or a boulder that looked like a person from his vantage point. But when he squinted, he saw clearly that it was a man, standing motionless, just outside the reach of his campfire's glow. "Hey," John called out, trying to be friendly. "Are you lost?" No response. The figure didn't move, nor did it acknowledge him in any way. It was unsettling, but John shrugged it off, assuming it was another camper who'd wandered off the trail and found a spot in the woods to rest. Maybe the man didn't want company, and John didn't want to intrude. He watched for a few more moments before turning his attention back to his campfire, but something about the stillness of the figure nagged at him. It was an odd sensation, being so sure someone was out there, yet not knowing why they would just stand there, silent and unmoving. But as the night wore on, the man was no longer visible. John tried to push it out of his mind, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He stoked the fire and decided to go to bed, hoping sleep would offer some relief. As he lay in his sleeping bag, the sounds of the forest seemed to amplify. The chirping of crickets, the rustle of branches in the wind, and the soft burbling of the nearby stream. But it was something else that caught his attention. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, soft but distinct. They circled around his tent. John froze. The footsteps stopped just outside his tent, mere inches from the fabric. His breath caught in his throat. Whoever it was, they were close. He could hear the faintest exhale of breath, the slight shuffle of feet. It was as though someone was standing there, waiting, but there were no sounds of movement. No one spoke. The night had become unnervingly still. "Hello," John called out, his voice wavering slightly, though he tried to keep it calm. "Is someone out there?" Nothing. No response. The silence grew heavier, suffocating almost. He waited, but the footsteps didn't return, and no one answered. He listened for what seemed like hours, but no sound came from outside his tent. Eventually, exhaustion overcame him, and he fell into a fitful sleep, the unease lingering like a dark shadow at the back of his mind. Morning came slowly, but it brought no relief. John woke up early to the soft glow of dawn seeping through the trees. He unzipped the tent cautiously, still feeling the remnants of the previous night's strange encounter. As he stepped outside, he was met by a chilling sight. The ground around his campsite was covered in footprints, fresh, deep imprints in the dirt. They were everywhere, some leading up to his tent, others encircling it in a wide pattern, and some even going off into the trees. John's heart skipped a beat. These weren't the light prints of an animal. They were the clear, defined marks of boots. Human boots. but there was something off about the prints. They seemed to be in odd, irregular patterns, as though the person had been walking around aimlessly or circling the campsite. Whoever it was hadn't made a direct approach. They'd been moving slowly, cautiously, as if they were watching him. The footprints didn't lead to any other place. They simply stopped and started again in different areas, leading nowhere. John's mind raced. He couldn't explain it. The man he had seen yesterday had never moved or said a word. And now, these footprints, what did it all mean? As the day wore on, John packed up his things quickly, his unease growing with every passing minute. His instinct was to leave as fast as possible, to get back to the safety of civilization. But the moment he turned to walk away, he looked over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing between the trees again. Nothing. The woods were silent. The only sound was the crunch of dry leaves underfoot as he made his way back to his car. Even as he drove down the long, winding forest road, his mind kept flashing back to the figure standing there, motionless, watching. He never saw the man again, and when he spoke to park rangers on his way out, they assured him there was no record of anyone camping in the area recently. The nearest trailhead was miles away. To this day, John can't explain what happened that night in the forest. Was it just a strange encounter, a trick of the mind brought on by isolation? Or was there something or someone out there in the woods watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? All he knows is that something in the woods knew he was there, and for reasons he couldn't understand, it wanted him to feel watched. Story 8. The Old Campfire. Tasha and Ben were experienced campers, lovers of the great outdoors, always seeking new places to explore. They had planned their latest adventure for weeks, a camping trip to a remote canyon in the southwestern United States. The weather was warm, the skies clear, and they couldn't wait to experience the tranquility of the wilderness, far from the distractions of city life. After a long hike, they arrived at a secluded spot along the edge of the canyon, the terrain rugged and wild, the air dry and crisp. They set up camp near a small creek that trickled softly over the rocks, the sound soothing after the strenuous hike. As they gathered firewood, Tasha noticed something strange in the distance, a clearing that looked out of place, the remnants of what seemed like a camp. Curious, they walked over, weaving through the brush and boulders. The sight that greeted them was unnerving. There, in the center of the clearing, was a burnt-out campfire surrounded by scattered gear. A tent, partially collapsed, lay in a heap. Nearby, they spotted a backpack, an overturned pot, and a few other belongings, a jacket, a pair of boots. It looked as if the campers had left in a hurry, the items abandoned, as though someone had been interrupted mid-task. "That's odd," Ben said, kneeling next to the backpack. "No signs of anyone around. It doesn't look like they were out for long." Tasha knelt beside the fire pit. "Do you smell that?" she asked. The air was thick with the smell of burnt wood, but there was something else, a faint, sour odor, like something had been cooked over the fire recently. The couple exchanged uneasy glances but shrugged it off, deciding to focus on setting up their own camp. Ben lit a fire of their own, and as the night wore on, they tried to forget about the strange campsite. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the canyon walls, and the stars began to emerge, twinkling above. They settled in by their fire, enjoying the warmth, but the eerie feeling of the abandoned camp lingered in the back of their minds. Around midnight, Tasha woke up to a strange smell in the air. It wasn't the familiar scent of the campfire that had been crackling in front of them. It was something different. She sat up, her senses alert, the faint smell of smoke stronger now. She glanced over at Ben, who was still asleep, unaware of the change. But then she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Outside their tent, through the mesh window, she could see the flickering glow of a fire. The same place, the clearing. Was the campfire lit again? Her pulse quickened. That's impossible, she thought. We didn't see anyone leave the campsite, and the fire had burned out hours ago. She carefully unzipped the tent and slipped outside, trying to move quietly so as not to wake Ben. The light from the fire seemed to be coming from the exact spot where they had found the abandoned campsite. But when Tasha arrived, the fire burned brightly, casting an eerie glow over the area. It was strange, unnaturally bright, like something had reignited the embers with unnatural force. But there was no one there. Her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the area, her eyes darting around. There were no other campers, no sounds of movement, just the fire, burning hot and strong in the still, cold night. Tasha stepped closer to the fire pit, trying to understand what was happening. She felt a strange pressure in the air, like the stillness before a storm. As she reached the edge of the firelight, she heard something, footsteps crunching softly in the dry underbrush. But when she turned, there was no one there. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She turned back toward the fire, hoping for some sort of explanation, but found nothing. The ground around the fire was undisturbed, not a single footprint, just the charred remains of the old campsite and the glowing embers. Tasha quickly retreated back to the tent, her heart racing. She unzipped it and crawled in, waking Ben with a shaky hand. "Ben, there's something wrong," she whispered. "The fire's back. It's burning in the same spot as the abandoned campsite, but there's no one around." Ben groggily rubbed his eyes and looked out the tent, squinting into the darkness. "Are you sure? Maybe we just missed someone coming back." Tasha shook her head, her voice trembling. "No, I saw it. It's just wrong. I can't explain it." Ben stared at her for a moment, then sighed and got out of the tent. He slowly made his way toward the clearing, the soft crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only sound in the night. Tasha stayed behind, watching from the safety of the tent, her mind racing with questions. Minutes passed. Ben returned with a confused look on his face. "There's nothing there," he said. "The fire's gone now, but there's no sign of anyone. Just the burnt-out embers from earlier. It's like someone came back and lit the fire, but vanished again." Tasha looked at him, disbelief settling in. But how? Who could have? They both stood in silence for a long time, the only sounds the whisper of the wind and the rustling of leaves. The feeling of being watched crept over them, a tension in the air they couldn't shake. They spent the rest of the night in their tent, alert, eyes wide, unable to fully relax. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. every shadow outside the tent a potential threat. When dawn finally broke, they emerged, hoping for some sense of normalcy, but the air still felt heavy, as if the night had never truly ended. As they packed up to leave, they took one last look at the clearing. The fire pit was cold, the ashes long gone. There was no sign of anyone, or anything, that might have caused the strange events. No footprints, no burned out wood, just an empty, silent clearing. They left the canyon that day, but the memory of the old campfire and the unanswered questions that lingered in the air stayed with them long after the trip was over. The fire had burned again, but it was as though something darker, something older, had been there, watching them from the shadows, and they would never forget it. Story 9. The Whispering Wind. The desert was quiet, too quiet. The group of friends, 4 in total, had driven out to the remote dunes in southern Arizona, far away from the buzz of the city, to get a taste of the wilderness. They had set up camp just as the sun began to sink below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. It was the perfect place to escape, to unwind. The night promised starlit skies, the crisp desert air, and the kind of silence only the desert could provide. They gathered around their campfire, its glow casting shadows on the sand as they cracked open beers and shared stories of old camping trips. The fire flickered with a gentle breeze, sending occasional whispers of heat toward their faces. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. As the night deepened and the stars became clearer, the group started to feel the weight of the desert's solitude. It was a different kind of silence than they were used to, one that seemed to stretch on for miles without interruption. The wind began to pick up slightly, brushing through the scattered cactus and the soft sand, but the chill of the evening air had yet to settle in. At first it was faint, just the wind whispering through the cracks in the dunes. But then, as the gusts picked up speed, something odd happened. One of the friends, Sarah, who was sitting closest to the fire, leaned in toward the others. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the flames. The others looked at her, puzzled. "Hear what?" Mark asked, wiping his hands on his jeans. "It sounds like whispering, like voices," she said slowly, straining to listen. The others chuckled lightly. "You're just hearing the wind," Greg said, trying to reassure her. "The desert plays tricks like that." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She leaned forward again, her head tilting slightly as she listened. The whispers seemed to be getting clearer, almost like murmuring voices, rising and falling with the gusts of wind. "I swear," she said, "I hear someone calling my name." The group fell silent. The desert, known for its stillness, was now full of strange whispers. It wasn't the kind of noise you'd expect from a breeze. This was something different, something almost intentional. "I think we should head to bed," Mark said, trying to brush off the unease that had crept into the air. "Let's not overthink it." The group agreed and retreated to their tents, trying to shake off the weird sensation. However, as they lay down on their sleeping bags, the whispers outside only grew louder. "Sarah," came a voice, faint but distinct. "Sarah." Her heart raced as she lay still, holding her breath. She wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was outside calling her name. Her eyes darted to the tent flap, half expecting to see a shadow in the moonlight. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to Mark, who was lying next to her in the same tent. "Hear what?" Mark responded, clearly irritated by her anxiety. "Someone's calling my name," Sarah said, her voice trembling now. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Mark gave a small sigh, convinced she was just spooked by the vast, lonely desert. "It's just the wind," he said, turning over to go back to sleep. But Sarah couldn't sleep. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder and clearer, and now they weren't just calling her name. They were calling everyone's name. "Mark, Greg, Sarah." The voices, shifting and swaying like a chorus of unseen speakers, came from all directions. At first, they seemed distant, but slowly, they began to draw nearer, growing louder and more insistent with every passing minute. Sarah's skin prickled with dread as she heard her name again, this time from right outside the tent. "Sarah." She shot up in her sleeping bag, her heart hammering in her chest. The others were awake now too, their eyes wide with fear. "That's not the wind," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "Someone's out there." "I heard it too," Greg said, sitting up abruptly. "It's coming from the dunes. Over there." The group scrambled out of their tents, each of them armed with a flashlight. The desert was eerily still, save for the wind whispering through the sand. But the voices, those voices, were now unmistakable. They weren't just whispering, they were calling, beckoning. And they weren't just calling names. They were murmuring something else, something more sinister. "Come closer. Come to us." The group stood frozen, their flashlights cutting through the dark desert. No one was in sight. No one was moving. But the voices were still there, creeping up from the dunes, getting louder and louder. "That's enough," Greg finally said, his voice cracking. "We need to leave." The group didn't hesitate. They gathered their belongings quickly, not even bothering to take down the tents. They didn't care about the mess, only that they needed to get out of there. The wind seemed to pick up again, howling in their ears as they made their way back to their vehicles. As they packed into the car, they dared not look back. The whispers, no, the voices, seemed to follow them, faint but persistent. When they reached the nearest town and stopped to catch their breath, they found a park ranger at a small gas station. "Did you guys hear anything out there?" Greg asked, his voice low and tense. The ranger looked at them curiously. "Out in the desert, you mean?" "Yes, we heard voices. People calling our names," Greg said, trying to explain what had happened. The ranger nodded slowly, his face pale. "You weren't the first to hear that. A few years back, a group of hikers went missing out there. They said they heard voices too, calling them into the dunes. No one ever found them. Some say it's the wind, but I wouldn't trust the desert after dark." The friends left the desert that night, and though they had no answers, they all shared the same unsettling feeling that something had been out there, something that wasn't human. They never spoke of the trip again, but each of them knew the desert held secrets that no one should seek to uncover. Story 10. The Vanishing Campfire. It was the kind of camping trip that, on the surface, seemed perfect. Steve and Mark, two old friends from college, had been talking about this adventure for months. An escape into the woods, far from the noise of the city, deep into the heart of the wilderness. They had driven for hours, their car winding through narrow, gravel roads until they finally reached their spot, nestled in a secluded valley. The area was isolated, no other campers, no cell phone service, just the sound of birds chirping and the wind rustling through the trees. They set up their tent as dusk settled, the fading light casting long shadows on the forest floor. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Steve lit the campfire, its warm glow flickering in the gathering darkness. Mark started to unpack their gear, joking about the long drive and how much they both needed a break from their hectic lives. But just as they were settling into their campsite, Steve noticed something unusual. Off in the distance, through the trees, there was a faint light. It wasn't the usual flash of a distant car's headlights or the soft glow of a town far away. No, this light looked like the unmistakable flicker of a campfire. "Hey, do you see that?" Steve asked, nudging Mark. Mark squinted, peering through the trees. "Yeah, it looks like it's coming from somewhere deep in the woods. Should we check it out?" Steve asked, grabbing his flashlight. Mark, always the adventurous one, agreed. "Why not? Maybe it's other campers. I'm not in the mood to sit alone by this fire all night." They grabbed their flashlights and, after a quick glance at their camp to make sure everything was secure, began to walk toward the mysterious light. The walk was easy at first, the soft dirt path barely noticeable beneath their feet. But as they got closer, something felt off. The air grew heavier, and the sounds of the forest seemed to hush, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The fire was still flickering ahead, casting an eerie orange glow through the trees. It was strange. The further they walked, the dimmer the light seemed to become. At first, they thought it was just the angle they were approaching from, but by the time they were close enough to make out the source of the light, the fire seemed to be fading. It was as if it were being swallowed up by the darkness. When they finally emerged into a small clearing, there was no campfire at all. There was no trace of warmth, no burning embers, not even a pile of ash. The ground was cold and untouched, the earth unbroken. The only thing that remained was the faint smell of smoke that lingered in the air, almost as if the fire had just been there a moment ago. "What the hell?" Mark muttered, looking around nervously. "I swear it was right here." Steve's flashlight swept over the clearing, but there was nothing. No other campers, no signs of life. "Maybe they packed up and left," Steve said, his voice wavering. "But this doesn't make sense. The fire was too bright to just disappear like that." Mark glanced around, uneasy. "We should head back. This feels wrong." But just as they turned to leave, something caught Steve's eye. Movement at the edge of the clearing, a figure slipping between the trees. For a moment, he thought he saw someone, but by the time he shone the light in the direction, there was nothing. No footprints, no sounds, just the dense woods stretching out in every direction. "Okay, yeah, this is getting creepy," Steve said, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. "Let's get back to the tent." They quickly retraced their steps, hurrying back to their campsite. As they reached the clearing where their tent had been, something immediately felt wrong. The fire they had left burning was now completely extinguished, the smoke no longer rising into the air. But that wasn't what unsettled them. What disturbed them was that their camp, everything they had left behind, had been disturbed. The tent flap was wide open, even though they had zipped it shut when they left. The cooler was tipped over, its contents spilling out onto the forest floor. Their gear, once neatly arranged, was now scattered haphazardly around the site. And most unnerving of all, there were signs of someone or something having gone through their backpacks. "Did you?" Mark began, looking at Steve with wide eyes. "Did you leave the tent like this?" Steve's throat tightened. "No, I swear I zipped it up before we left. We were only gone for maybe 20 minutes. The feeling of dread deepened. Whoever, or whatever, had been at their campsite had been there recently. They could still feel the lingering presence, a weight in the air that made their skin crawl, the feeling of being watched. They checked their belongings, but it was hard to tell what had been taken or tampered with. It didn't make sense. No one should have been able to find their camp so quickly, and certainly not without leaving any signs of their presence. Maybe it was just some other campers who came by and were messing with us, Steve suggested, but his voice didn't carry the same confidence as before. "I don't know. Maybe we should leave." Mark didn't reply. He was staring into the dark forest, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "I don't think it was other campers," he said quietly. "Whoever, or whatever, was here, they didn't leave any trace. They stayed up the rest of the night, too frightened to sleep." The woods outside their tent were silent, but the tension in the air was suffocating. The feeling of being watched never left them. The next morning, when the sun finally broke through the trees, they packed up their gear and left without saying a word. Neither of them spoke about the vanishing campfire or the unsettling disturbance at their site for the rest of the trip. But they both knew, deep down, that something had been wrong out there. Something that had watched them. Something that had been lurking in the woods, just beyond the reach of their campfire's light. And whatever it wasn't human. The woods were meant to be a place of peace and escape. But that night, they learned that some parts of nature hold secrets best left undisturbed.